September 1st, 1939. A single German armored column rolled across the Polish border near the town of Wieluń, expecting minimal resistance. Within 48 hours, Wehrmacht planners confidently predicted Poland would collapse like a house of cards. The Blitzkrieg doctrine had never failed. Speed, shock, and overwhelming firepower would shatter Polish defenses before they could even mobilize. But 9 days later, at a fortress most Germans had never heard of, that confidence would die in flames. Westerplatte, a tiny peninsula jutting into the Baltic Sea near Gdańsk, would become the graveyard of 47 Panzer division's reputation and the birthplace of a resistance that stunned the entire German high command. What happened in those 9 days would force the Wehrmacht to completely recalculate their understanding of Polish military capability and rewrite their entire invasion timeline. The mathematics of German arrogance were built on recent history. Austria had fallen without a shot in 1938. Czechoslovakia had surrendered its fortifications without resistance 6 months later. Every intelligence report, every strategic assessment, every operational plan assumed Poland would follow the same pattern. Major General Friedrich Wilhelm von Chapuis, Chief of Staff for the 4th Panzer Division, wrote in his pre-invasion briefing that Polish forces would disintegrate within 48 hours of contact. The garrison at Westerplatte, he noted dismissively, would surrender after a single artillery barrage. It was a military outpost, not a fortress. A customs depot manned by transit guards, not soldiers. The Germans had allocated exactly 2 hours for its capture in their operational timeline. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. Westerplatte had never been intended as a fortress. The Treaty of Versailles, signed after the First World War, had created the free city of Danzig as a compromise between German and Polish territorial claims. Poland received the right to maintain a small military transit depot on the peninsula to guard its imports through Danzig's port. The treaty specified exact limitations: 88 soldiers, maximum, light, defensive weapons only, no fortifications beyond basic guardhouses. For 15 years, Poland had technically observed these restrictions while quietly preparing for the war everyone knew was coming. Major Henryk Sucharski, appointed commander in 1937, understood his mission with brutal clarity. Westerplatte could not be held indefinitely. The peninsula measured barely 500 meters long and 200 meters wide. It had no natural defenses, no high ground, no water source beyond a single well. Surrounded by German territory on 3 sides and the Baltic Sea on the 4th, it could be bombarded from land and sea simultaneously. But Sucharski had been given different orders than simple defense. Hold for 12 hours, his superiors instructed. Give the main Polish forces time to mobilize. Convince the world that Poland would fight. 12 hours was considered optimistic. Most military analysts gave them 6. The garrison that assembled at Westerplatte in August 1939 consisted of exactly 210 men, more than twice the treaty limit, a violation Germany would cite as justification for attack. But these were not the undertrained transit guards German intelligence reported. Captain Franciszek Dąbrowski had hand-selected veterans from the Polish Army's best units. Sergeant Major Wojciech Nysarek had fought in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. Lieutenant Leon Pająk was an engineering specialist who had studied German fortification techniques. Corporal Stefan Grodecki was a former mining engineer who understood explosives better than most artillery officers. They had spent 2 years transforming the depot into something the Germans would not expect. Using the cover of routine maintenance and supply deliveries, Polish engineers had constructed 5 reinforced concrete bunkers disguised as storage buildings. Each bunker had walls 1.5 meters thick, reinforced with steel rails from dismantled railway tracks. The main guardhouse, labeled Building Number 1 on German maps, had been rebuilt with a foundation extending 3 meters underground, creating a bomb shelter that could withstand naval artillery. Trenches connecting the positions had been dug and reinforced with concrete, then carefully camouflaged with transplanted vegetation. Machine gun positions were built into artificial hills that appeared natural from aerial reconnaissance. The single anti-tank gun, a French 37mm piece that was already obsolete, was positioned in a reinforced pit with overlapping fields of fire. Barbed wire, officially for perimeter security, was laid in patterns designed to channel attacking infantry into kill zones. Landmines strictly prohibited under the treaty were buried along every approach route. The Germans had aerial photographs of Westerplatte taken as recently as August 20th. Their intelligence officers saw exactly what they expected to see: a few wooden buildings, some storage warehouses, a small dock, nothing that required more than a single infantry company to capture. At 4:47 on the morning of September 1st, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, ostensibly in Danzig harbor for a courtesy visit, opened fire on Westerplatte from point-blank range. The ship's 11-inch guns, designed to destroy enemy battleships, fired directly into the peninsula at a range of less than 300 meters. The first salvo demolished the main warehouse and set the fuel depot ablaze. The second salvo destroyed the barracks building, where, German intelligence believed, the entire garrison was sleeping. Smoke and flames engulfed the peninsula. German observers aboard the Schleswig-Holstein reported the garrison's destruction within 7 minutes of the first shot. At precisely 5 o'clock, a full marine assault company, the 3rd Company of the Schleswig-Holstein, 250 men, equipped with flamethrowers and demolition charges, landed on the peninsula, expecting to find wounded survivors and burning ruins. Instead, they found a fully manned defensive position that had weathered the naval bombardment with surprisingly few casualties. The Polish defenders had been awake and in position since 3 in the morning, warned by intelligence reports that an attack was imminent. When the battleship's guns opened fire, the garrison was already sheltered in the reinforced bunkers. The buildings the Germans destroyed were decoys, empty structures maintained specifically to draw fire away from actual defensive positions. As the German Marines advanced across the peninsula, confident they were conducting a mop-up operation, they walked directly into a carefully prepared ambush. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions the Germans hadn't known existed. The French anti-tank gun, firing at close range against infantry targets, scythed through the assault formation. Rifle fire from the trenches caught the Marines in a crossfire. Within 15 minutes, 16 German Marines were dead and 120 wounded. The survivors retreated in disorder, leaving their dead behind. The German company commander, Lieutenant Commander Gustav Kleikamp, reported to his superiors that Westerplatte was heavily fortified with at least 500 defenders and multiple artillery pieces. The intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. If Westerplatte was a fortress, it would be treated like a fortress. The Schleswig-Holstein resumed bombardment, firing over 400 shells into the tiny peninsula over the next 6 hours. The Luftwaffe dispatched Stuka dive bombers, the same aircraft that were terrorizing Polish cities, to destroy the bunkers. 60 bombers attacked in waves, dropping 500-kilogram bombs designed to penetrate concrete fortifications. Artillery batteries on the shore, including heavy 105mm howitzers, added their fire to the bombardment. For 6 straight hours, Westerplatte endured an artillery barrage that exceeded anything the Western Front had witnessed in the First World War, concentrated on an area smaller than most city parks. The bunkers held. The concrete walls, reinforced with steel rails and sunk deep into the sandy soil, absorbed direct hits from naval guns and aerial bombs. The underground sections provided shelter from the bombardment. Casualties were remarkably light: 3 dead, 7 wounded. But the conditions inside the bunkers became hellish. The concussion from near misses caused internal bleeding and ruptured eardrums. Concrete dust filled the air, making breathing difficult. The temperature inside the sealed bunkers climbed above 40 degrees Celsius. Water supplies, already limited, were contaminated when the main storage tank took a direct hit. Soldiers began showing symptoms of heat exhaustion and dehydration. Major Sucharski understood his situation with painful clarity. His 12-hour mission had already been achieved. The German Blitzkrieg had been delayed by an entire day at Westerplatte alone. Polish forces elsewhere had gained time to mobilize. The world now knew that Poland would resist. His orders had been fulfilled. Surrender would be honorable. But that evening, as Sucharski prepared to send a surrender delegation under white flag, something unexpected happened. Radio communication with Polish forces on the Hel Peninsula, 40 kilometers away, across the bay, brought news that changed everything. The main Polish army was holding. German advances were slower than expected. Cavalry units were counterattacking. The Polish Air Force was still flying. If Westerplatte could hold even one more day, it would tie down German forces needed elsewhere. Captain Dąbrowski, Sucharski's second-in-command, argued passionately against surrender. They had ammunition remaining. The fortifications were intact. The garrison's morale was unbroken. Every hour they held was an hour the Wehrmacht could not use those troops elsewhere. Sucharski, a career officer who understood military realism, made a decision that defied every tactical calculation. They would hold another day. September 2nd brought a new German assault, this time by a full Wehrmacht infantry battalion, the 3rd Battalion of the 69th Infantry Regiment, supported by combat engineers equipped with flamethrowers and demolition charges. The Germans had studied the peninsula's defenses overnight and identified what they believed were weak points in the Polish perimeter. At dawn, under cover of renewed naval bombardment, 300 German soldiers advanced across the bullet-swept ground. They made it further than the Marines had the previous day, reaching the outer Polish trenches before defensive fire stopped them. German combat engineers crawling forward under covering fire managed to get flamethrowers within range of the Polish positions. Liquid fire washed over the trenches, forcing defenders back into the bunkers. For a moment, it appeared the German assault would succeed. Then the Poles counterattacked. Soldiers emerged from the bunkers, moving through communication trenches the Germans hadn't spotted, and hit the German flanks with grenades and rifle fire. The Polish anti-tank gun, repositioned during the night, caught the German reserves in the open. After 3 hours of brutal close-quarters fighting, the Germans withdrew, leaving another 43 dead on the peninsula. The battalion commander reported that Westerplatte was defended by at least 800 soldiers with heavy weapons and extensive fortifications. German casualties had now exceeded 150 dead and over 300 wounded, captured a position that was supposed to fall in 2 hours. The siege settled into a grinding pattern. Each morning brought renewed bombardment. The Schleswig-Holstein fired until its gun barrels overheated. Stuka dive bombers attacked in waves whenever weather permitted. Artillery from shore positions fired throughout the day. Then, in late afternoon, German infantry would assault, probing for weaknesses, testing the Polish defenses, and each time, the Poles held. The German high command was becoming increasingly embarrassed, while Wehrmacht forces advanced across Poland, capturing cities and destroying Polish field armies. A tiny garrison on a worthless peninsula continued to resist. International journalists, still allowed in Danzig during the war's first days, reported on Westerplatte's resistance. Newsreels showed the peninsula under bombardment, a symbol of Polish defiance. The propaganda value of the garrison's resistance far exceeded its military importance. Hitler himself took notice, reportedly demanding daily briefings on why Westerplatte had not fallen. By September 4th, conditions inside the Polish defenses had become desperate. The water supply was nearly exhausted, with soldiers receiving less than half a liter per day in brutal late summer heat. Food stocks were running low, reduced to hardtack and canned meat. Medical supplies were depleted, forcing the garrison doctor to perform surgeries without anesthesia. Ammunition was reaching critical levels, with machine gunners ordered to fire only at confirmed targets. The constant bombardment was taking its psychological toll. Several soldiers showed signs of shell shock, unable to function during attacks. Others had gone partially deaf from the constant explosions. Sleep was impossible except during brief lulls in the bombardment. Yet, morale remained surprisingly high. The soldiers understood they were holding far longer than anyone had expected. Radio broadcasts from Warsaw mentioned Westerplatte by name, calling the garrison heroes. The knowledge that their resistance mattered, that every hour they held helped Poland, sustained them through conditions that would have broken most units. September 5th brought the heaviest bombardment yet. The Germans, frustrated by their inability to reduce the fortress quickly, committed additional resources. Heavy artillery pieces, including massive 210mm mortars designed to destroy fortresses, were brought up and positioned on the shore. The Luftwaffe doubled its sortie rate, with Stukas attacking every hour throughout the day. The Schleswig-Holstein was joined by 2 destroyers, adding their guns to the bombardment. Over 1,000 shells and bombs struck Westerplatte in a single day, pulverizing everything above ground. The warehouse district was completely destroyed, reduced to burning rubble. The dock facilities were obliterated. Every tree on the peninsula was splintered or burning. The landscape had been transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Incredibly, the bunkers still held, though damage was accumulating. Bunker number 2 took a direct hit from a 210mm shell that penetrated one wall but failed to detonate. Bunker 5's entrance was buried by collapsing soil, trapping its garrison inside for 6 hours until they could dig themselves out. The Polish hospital bunker, marked with a red cross that German gunners ignored, was hit 3 times. That evening, Major Sacharski called his officers together for a council of war. The situation was beyond critical. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Water was rationed to a cup per man per day. 17 soldiers were wounded, with 3 in critical condition needing evacuation. The fortifications, while still standing, were deteriorating under the relentless bombardment. Sacharski presented the facts without emotion. They had held for 5 days, 10 times longer than ordered. They had inflicted over 300 casualties on the Germans. They had tied down forces the Wehrmacht desperately needed elsewhere. They had done their duty, exceeded it magnificently. Surrender was now not just justified, but militarily necessary. Every officer present agreed with Sacharski's assessment, except one. Captain Dąbrowski rose and spoke words that would become legendary in Polish military history. "We have ammunition for 1 more day," he said. "We have water for 1 more day. We have strength for 1 more day. Therefore, we have duty for 1 more day." The council voted unanimously to continue the defense. September 6th dawned with a new German strategy. Unable to destroy the bunkers with bombardment, the Germans would use siege warfare tactics unchanged since medieval times. They would starve the garrison out, bombard them continuously, and prevent any resupply or reinforcement. Combat engineers began constructing siege works on the shore, protected positions for artillery observers and snipers. The Germans surrounded the peninsula with patrol boats, ensuring no supplies could reach the defenders by sea. For the Polish garrison, September 6th was a day of survival rather than combat. The Germans launched only probing attacks, content to let bombardment and thirst do their work. Inside the bunkers, soldiers lay in the darkness, conserving energy, trying not to think about water. The garrison doctor, working with almost no supplies, did what he could for the wounded. Several soldiers wrote final letters to their families, messages they hoped would somehow reach home. Major Sacharski walked the positions, visiting each bunker, speaking quietly with his men. He made no speeches, offered no false hope. He simply thanked them for their service and asked if they could hold 1 more day. Every man said yes. September 7th brought a development that gave the garrison renewed hope. Radio contact with Polish forces on the Hel Peninsula reported that Polish cavalry units had launched a successful counterattack near Częstochowa, destroying elements of a German armored division. The counterattack had failed to break through German lines, but it proved that Polish forces were still fighting, still resisting. If Westerplatte could hold longer, perhaps relief forces might reach them. Perhaps the British and French, who had declared war on Germany on September 3rd, would launch an offensive in the west, forcing Germany to withdraw troops from Poland. Perhaps, Captain Dombrowski knew these were desperate hopes, but hope was all they had left. The German bombardment on September 7th reached a new intensity. The Wehrmacht had brought up railway guns, massive artillery pieces designed to destroy fortresses, and positioned them on the shore. These monsters fired shells weighing over 800 kilograms, each one equivalent to a small aerial bomb. The first shell from these guns struck bunker number 4, penetrating the roof and detonating inside. The explosion killed 5 soldiers instantly and wounded 8 others. The bunker's structural integrity was compromised, forcing its evacuation. The defenders crowded into the remaining bunkers, now packed beyond capacity, heat and thirst and exhaustion pushing men to the edge of endurance. That afternoon, German infantry made their most determined assault yet. A full regiment, the 68th Infantry Regiment, supported by combat engineers with flamethrowers and explosive charges, attacked across the entire Polish perimeter simultaneously. The assault was preceded by a rolling artillery barrage that walked across the peninsula, destroying any position that showed signs of life. Polish defenders, down to their last ammunition, held fire until the Germans were at point-blank range. Then, in a final display of defiance, they poured everything remaining into the attacking formations. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red, riflemen shot until their ammunition was exhausted. The French anti-tank gun fired its last 7 rounds directly into the German assault, each shell killing or wounding multiple soldiers. German combat engineers reached the bunker entrances and deployed flamethrowers, washing the positions with liquid fire. Polish soldiers, rather than burn, rushed out with fixed bayonets and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. For 2 hours, the battle raged at close quarters, Germans and Poles fighting with rifles, pistols, grenades, bayonets, and fists. When the Germans finally withdrew, they left 73 dead and over 100 wounded on the peninsula. But the Polish defenders were finished. Ammunition was completely exhausted. The anti-tank gun had no shells remaining. Machine guns had no bullets. Soldiers had fired every round they possessed. The wounded numbered 42 out of a garrison that now counted less than 170 effectives. That evening, Major Sucharski made his final decision. He had pushed his men beyond human limits. They had held not for 12 hours, but for 7 days. They had inflicted over 500 German casualties. They had become an international symbol of Polish resistance, but they could hold no longer. Without ammunition, without water, without any possibility of relief, further resistance meant the annihilation of his entire garrison. He would not sacrifice his men in a gesture that had already been made. At 2100 hours, on September 7th, 1939, Major Henryk Sucharski sent a messenger under white flag to the German lines with an offer of surrender. The Germans, shocked that Westerplatte was still holding after 7 days of siege, agreed to ceasefire negotiations. But the formal surrender would not occur until the next morning, allowing both sides to recover their wounded and dead. Throughout the night of September 7th, the bombardment stopped for the first time in 7 days. In the sudden silence, Polish soldiers emerged from their bunkers and stood under the stars. Some wept, others prayed. Many simply stood in stunned exhaustion, unable to comprehend that the ordeal was ending. September 8th, 1939 dawned clear and cool, a beautiful late summer morning on the Baltic coast. At 0400 hours, Major Sucharski formally surrendered Westerplatte to General Friedrich Georg Eberhard, commander of the German forces besieging the peninsula. The surrender ceremony was brief and surprisingly respectful. General Eberhard, who had lost over 500 men, capturing a position held by barely 200 defenders, understood that he stood before warriors who had earned respect through blood and courage. He allowed the Polish garrison to parade under arms before stacking their weapons. He permitted Major Sucharski to retain his sidearm, a traditional gesture of respect to a brave opponent. German soldiers lining the route as the Poles marched into captivity reportedly stood silent, offering no insults, no mockery. They had fought these men for 7 days and knew what they had faced. The Polish garrison numbered 182 survivors, down from 210 who had manned the defenses on September 1st. 15 were dead, killed in the fighting. 53 were wounded, some so severely they would not survive captivity. But every single man walked out under his own power, refusing stretchers, maintaining discipline to the end. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fall of Westerplatte marked the end of organized resistance in the Danzig region, but its impact on the German invasion timeline and German military planning was profound. The Wehrmacht had allocated 2 hours to capture Westerplatte in their operational plans. Instead, the siege had consumed 7 days, tied down an entire regiment that was desperately needed elsewhere, cost over 500 casualties that Germany could ill afford, and forced the German High Command to divert resources, including heavy artillery and air support, away from the main invasion. The 47 Panzer divisions that were supposed to race across Poland unopposed found themselves delayed by pockets of resistance that fought with the same determination shown at Westerplatte. Polish cavalry units that were supposed to disintegrate instead launched counterattacks. Polish infantry that was supposed to surrender instead fought to the last bullet. The entire German operational timeline, based on assumptions of quick Polish collapse, had to be rewritten. The Battle of Bzura, which occurred 2 weeks after Westerplatte fell, saw Polish forces launch the largest counterattack of the campaign, nearly breaking through German lines. Though ultimately unsuccessful, it demonstrated that Polish military capability had been vastly underestimated by German planners. The siege of Westerplatte became the opening chapter of a story the Germans had not expected to write, the story of determined resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. In the years that followed, as Germany occupied Poland, the memory of Westerplatte sustained Polish resistance movements. The soldiers who had held for 7 days, when ordered to hold for 12 hours, became symbols of national defiance. Their example inspired the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, the resistance fighters of the Home Army, and countless acts of sabotage and defiance throughout the occupation. The Germans, for their part, learned a lesson at Westerplatte that would serve them poorly in the years ahead. They learned that determination and preparation could offset tremendous disadvantages in firepower and numbers. Unfortunately, they assumed this lesson applied only to Germans. When the Wehrmacht faced Soviet defenders at Stalingrad and Kursk, at Leningrad and Moscow, they discovered that other nations had learned from Poland's example. Prepared defenders in fortified positions, willing to fight to the last, could not be swept aside by Blitzkrieg tactics alone. The psychological impact of Westerplatte's resistance rippled far beyond the smoking ruins of that tiny peninsula. In Berlin, the German High Command convened emergency meetings to understand how their intelligence had been so catastrophically wrong. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, demanded explanations for why a garrison of 200 men had held for 7 days against forces that should have overwhelmed them in hours. The reports that came back were disturbing. Polish forces across the entire front were fighting harder than expected. The Blitzkrieg was succeeding, but at costs the planners had not anticipated. German casualty reports for the first week of the Polish campaign showed over 10,000 dead and wounded, numbers that exceeded projections by 300%. The myth of German invincibility, so carefully constructed through bloodless victories in Austria and Czechoslovakia, had encountered its first serious challenge. Major Henryk Sucharski and his men were transported to prisoner of war camps in Germany, where they expected the brutal treatment that Nazi propaganda had promised for Slavic prisoners. Instead, they encountered something unexpected: respect German guards who had fought in the First World War recognized fellow soldiers who had done their duty against impossible odds. The commandant of Oflag 2C, where many Westerplatte defenders were imprisoned, personally greeted Major Sucharski and told him that Germany's soldiers understood courage when they saw it. This respect, while genuine at the individual level, could not mask the horror of what was unfolding across Poland. As September progressed, news filtered into the prison camps of atrocities committed by German forces against Polish civilians. The carefully constructed myth of honorable warfare, so evident in the treatment of Westerplatte's defenders, was revealed as a facade. SS units, following behind the Wehrmacht, were executing Polish intellectuals, priests, and community leaders in systematic campaigns of terror. The distinction between military and civilian targets, so carefully observed at Westerplatte, was being obliterated across Poland. Captain Franciszek Dąbrowski, imprisoned at Oflag 7th, a Murnau, kept a secret diary throughout his captivity. His entries reveal a man struggling to understand the contradiction between the respect shown to Polish soldiers and the genocide being inflicted on Polish civilians. In an entry from October 1939, he wrote that German officers who praised Westerplatte's defense also spoke casually of Polish inferiority and the need for German living space. They could honor us as warriors, Dąbrowski observed, while simultaneously planning the destruction of our nation. This cognitive dissonance, he concluded, was the true face of Nazism, a system that could acknowledge individual courage while denying collective humanity. The news of Westerplatte's defense spread through occupied Poland like wildfire, becoming a story whispered in cellars and passed through underground newspapers. The Home Army, Poland's resistance organization, adopted the peninsula's lighthouse as a symbol of defiance. Resistance cells called themselves Westerplatte groups, invoking the memory of soldiers who had held when holding cities seemed impossible. Young men and women, facing the prospect of 5 years of brutal occupation, drew strength from knowing that their nation had fought back, had resisted, had made the Germans pay for every meter of Polish soil. The international response to Westerplatte's defense was equally significant. When British and French newspapers reported that a tiny Polish garrison had held for 7 days against the full might of the Wehrmacht, it challenged the narrative of German military superiority. If 200 Poles with limited weapons could inflict 500 German casualties and delay the Blitzkrieg, what might properly equipped British and French forces achieve? The battle provided ammunition for those arguing that Germany could be defeated, that Nazi aggression could be stopped. Winston Churchill, not yet Prime Minister, but already a prominent voice for resistance, cited Westerplatte in a speech to Parliament as proof that totalitarian powers could be opposed successfully by determined free peoples. The story gave hope to those who feared that Hitler's Germany was unstoppable. Yet, this hope was tempered by harsh reality. By October 6, 1939, organized Polish military resistance had ended. The Soviet Union, acting under the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, had invaded eastern Poland on September 17th. Poland's army, fighting desperately against Germany in the west, found itself attacked from the east by forces it had considered potential allies. The two-front war proved impossible to sustain. Polish forces surrendered or retreated into Romania and Hungary, where many were interned. Poland, as an independent nation, ceased to exist, divided between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. The survivors of Westerplatte watched from their prison camps as their country was erased from the map. Major Sucharski, learning of Poland's complete defeat, fell into a depression that would haunt him for years. He had held for 7 days, done everything possible, exceeded every expectation. Yet, Poland had still fallen. In the brutal arithmetic of total war, individual courage and tactical success meant nothing against strategic, overwhelming force. The guilt of survival, the knowledge that he lived while Poland died, nearly destroyed him. His fellow officers tried to console him, reminding him that Westerplatte's resistance had inspired the nation, had shown the world that Poland would fight. But Sucharski struggled with the question that haunts every commander who survives when his nation falls. What was the point? Lieutenant Leon Pająk, the engineering officer who had designed much of Westerplatte's defenses, took a different lesson from the experience. In letters to his wife, smuggled out through the Red Cross, he wrote that Westerplatte had proven that preparation and determination could multiply a force's effectiveness many times over. Small nations could not match great powers in raw strength, but they could make conquest so costly that aggression became unprofitable. If Poland had fortified its entire border as thoroughly as Westerplatte had been fortified, if every town and city had prepared defenses with the same care, the German invasion might have stalled. The lesson, Pająk believed, was not that resistance was futile, but that resistance required preparation and will in equal measure. The German military, conducting its post-campaign analysis, reached uncomfortable conclusions about Westerplatte. The official report filed in November 1939 noted that the fortress had been inadequately scouted, that intelligence estimates had been based on outdated information and wishful thinking, that assumptions of easy victory had led to tactical mistakes in the initial assault. More disturbing was the casualty ratio. The Germans had lost 500 men, killed and wounded, to capture a position held by 200 defenders. That 2.5 to 1 ratio was barely acceptable in offensive operations and only achieved through overwhelming firepower advantages. If Poland's entire army had fought with Westerplatte's effectiveness, the campaign would have cost Germany 50,000 casualties instead of 16,000. Such losses, early in the war, might have derailed Hitler's entire strategic timeline. The report concluded with recommendations for improved intelligence gathering and more realistic assessment of enemy capabilities. These recommendations were filed and largely ignored. The Blitzkrieg had worked. Poland had fallen in 5 weeks. The Wehrmacht's confidence in its methods remained unshaken. This overconfidence would prove costly when Germany turned west in 1940. The invasion of France and the Low Countries succeeded brilliantly, but the Battle of Britain that followed showed that prepared defenders could indeed stop the Wehrmacht. British radar stations, like Westerplatte's hidden bunkers, were harder to destroy than German planners expected. British fighter pilots, like the Polish garrison, refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. The lessons of Westerplatte, unlearned by Germany, contributed to the Luftwaffe's first major defeat. The pattern would repeat throughout the war. At Tobruk in 1941, a small garrison of British and Australian troops held for 240 days against German siege, tying down forces desperately needed elsewhere. The defenders had studied the siege of Westerplatte and applied its lessons about prepared defenses and determined resistance. At Stalingrad, in 1942 and 1943, Soviet defenders turned every building into a fortress, every street into a killing ground. The Germans, trying to take the city house by house, found themselves facing the same tactical nightmare they had encountered at Westerplatte, multiplied across an entire city. The siege lasted 163 days and cost Germany an entire field army. The survivors of Westerplatte, scattered across German prison camps, followed the war's progress through smuggled newspapers and whispered rumors. They watched as the nation that had defeated them in 7 days found itself locked in battles that lasted months and years. They saw German casualty lists grow from thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Captain Dombrowski, in his secret diary, wrote that Westerplatte had been a microcosm of the entire war. Germany could win tactical victories through superior firepower, but each victory cost more than Germany could afford. Eventually, the arithmetic of attrition would catch up with the Wehrmacht. Wars were not won by taking ground, but by breaking the enemy's will to fight. Poland had lost ground in 1939, but Polish will had never broken. The Home Army continued fighting throughout the occupation. Polish forces reformed in exile, fighting alongside the Allies in every theater of war. Polish codebreakers working in France and Britain helped break the German Enigma cipher. Contributing to Allied intelligence superiority, Polish pilots flew in the Battle of Britain. Polish soldiers fought at Monte Cassino. Polish paratroopers jumped at Arnhem. The nation that Germany thought it had defeated in 5 weeks continued fighting for 6 years. Major Sucharski was liberated from Oflag to Sea on April 23, 1945, by Soviet forces advancing through Germany. He returned to a Poland that was free from Nazi occupation, but now under Soviet control. The heroism of Westerplatte was officially celebrated by the new communist government, but Sucharski himself was viewed with suspicion. He had been an officer in the pre-war Polish army, which made him potentially disloyal to the new Soviet-backed regime. He was never allowed to return to military service. He worked as a clerk, living quietly, avoiding attention. The man who had become Poland's greatest military hero of the war was reduced to filing papers in an obscure government office. The injustice of this, the fact that he had survived German captivity only to be persecuted by his own countrymen, deepened his depression. He died in 1946, officially of heart failure, though those who knew him said he died of a broken heart. Poland had survived, but the Poland he had fought for, independent and free, had not. Captain Dąbrowski survived the war and eventually published his diaries, providing historians with invaluable insights into the siege. He testified at post-war trials about German conduct during the battle, noting that while the Wehrmacht had fought honorably at Westerplatte, this honor had not extended to their treatment of Polish civilians. The same officers who had respected Polish soldiers had overseen or tolerated atrocities against Polish civilians. Dąbrowski spent his later years teaching military history, using Westerplatte as a case study in how small forces could resist larger ones through preparation, determination, and tactical skill. His lectures influenced a generation of Polish officers who understood that Poland's survival depended on being able to resist great powers through asymmetric means. The Polish military doctrine that emerged in the post-war years, emphasizing prepared defenses and total mobilization, owed much to the lessons of Westerplatte. Lieutenant Pająk, the engineering officer, worked after the war helping to rebuild Poland's shattered infrastructure. He designed fortifications along Poland's western border, incorporating lessons learned from Westerplatte about the importance of concealment, depth, and interconnected defensive positions. His work contributed to making Poland's defenses formidable enough that the Soviet Union, when it dominated Eastern Europe during the Cold War, never seriously considered invading Poland, despite political tensions. The physical site of Westerplatte became a memorial after the war, one of Poland's most sacred national shrines. The ruins of the bunkers were preserved as they fell, testament to the bombardment they had endured. A massive monument was erected, listing the names of all who had fought there. Every year on September 1st, ceremonies are held commemorating the defense, attended by thousands of Poles who see in Westerplatte the embodiment of their national character, the willingness to fight impossible odds, to resist overwhelming force, to maintain honor in the face of certain defeat. Schoolchildren visit the site, walking among the ruins, trying to imagine 7 days under constant bombardment. Veterans of later Polish struggles from the Solidarity movement that eventually freed Poland from communist rule cite Westerplatte as inspiration. The lesson they draw is not that Poland always loses, but that Poland never stops fighting. The peninsula, where 200 men held for 7 days, has become a symbol of resistance that transcends its military significance. Historians studying the Battle of Westerplatte have noted its disproportionate impact on the broader war. The 7-day delay was operationally insignificant. Germany conquered Poland in 5 weeks, whether Westerplatte fell in 2 hours or 7 days. Yet, the psychological and symbolic impact was immense. Westerplatte proved that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that Blitzkrieg could be stopped, that prepared defenders could exact terrible costs from attackers. Every subsequent defender who held against German attack from Tobruk to Stalingrad to Normandy drew inspiration and tactical lessons from Westerplatte. The 200 Polish soldiers who held that tiny peninsula influenced defensive tactics throughout the remainder of the war. Military academies still study the siege as an example of how to defend against overwhelming odds, how to maximize the effectiveness of limited forces, how to impose costs on attackers through preparation and determination. The German officers who participated in the siege carried their memories for the rest of their lives. General Friedrich Georg Eberhard, who accepted Westerplatte's surrender, wrote in his memoirs that the battle had been a wake-up call about Polish military capability that the High Command had ignored. He noted that if German forces had approached every battle in Poland with the same respect for Polish defenders that they developed at Westerplatte, German tactics might have been different, more cautious, potentially less successful. The assumption of easy victory had led to casualties that need not have been suffered. Eberhard survived the war and spent his later years arguing that Germany's greatest military mistake had been underestimating its enemies. The Wehrmacht had been a superb fighting force, but its effectiveness had been undermined by ideological blindness that prevented accurate assessment of enemy capabilities. Westerplatte had shown this blindness clearly, but the lesson was never properly learned. The soldiers of Westerplatte's garrison, who survived the war and Poland's post-war communist regime, eventually received the recognition they deserved. When Poland regained full independence in 1989, the veterans were honored as national heroes. Those still living were promoted, awarded medals, invited to speak at schools and military academies. They told their stories to new generations of Poles who needed to understand that their nation's history was not one of constant defeat, but of constant resistance. The last survivor of Westerplatte's garrison, Corporal Stefan Grodecki, died in 2001 at the age of 89. His funeral was attended by thousands, a state occasion honoring not just one man, but an entire generation that had refused to surrender their nation without a fight. In his final interview, given weeks before his death, Grodecki was asked what he wanted people to remember about Westerplatte. His answer was simple, but profound. We were ordinary men, given an impossible task. We did not succeed in any military sense. We could not stop the German invasion. We could not save Poland, but we proved that Poles would fight. That was enough. That had to be enough. The story of Westerplatte resonates precisely because it is a story of defeat. The garrison lost. Poland lost. Yet, in that loss, was a victory of the human spirit that no military defeat could erase. The soldiers who held for 7 days, when ordered to hold for 12 hours, demonstrated that courage and preparation could multiply force effectiveness far beyond what numbers alone suggested. They showed that even the mightiest military machine could be resisted, that even hopeless battles could be fought with honor and effect. Their example inspired resistance throughout occupied Europe, influenced defensive tactics for the remainder of the war, and became a permanent symbol of their nation's refusal to accept subjugation. In the calculus of history, Westerplatte was a footnote to the German invasion of Poland, a minor tactical engagement that delayed the inevitable by a few days. But in the human story of the Second World War, it was something more. It was proof that individuals matter, that small groups of determined people can resist tyranny even when resistance seems futile, that the measure of a nation is not whether it wins or loses, but whether it fights. The 200 men who defended that tiny peninsula understood they could not win. They fought anyway. That choice, that refusal to surrender simply because defeat was inevitable, echoes across the decades as a testament to human dignity in the face of overwhelming force. Wars are won and lost by armies and nations, but they are fought by individuals who must decide moment by moment whether to continue or surrender. Westerplatte's defenders chose to continue, long past the point where continuation made tactical sense. Their example reminds us that some things transcend tactics, that honor and duty sometimes demand fighting, even when fighting cannot change the outcome. The German expectation of a 48-hour collapse was shattered by a 9-day stand that, while it did not destroy 47 Panzer divisions, literally destroyed something more important: the myth of inevitable German victory through overwhelming force. Every soldier, every defender, every resistance fighter who faced the Wehrmacht in the years that followed knew that the Germans could be resisted, that even with limited resources and no hope of victory, resistance was possible and meaningful. Westerplatte taught that lesson in blood and fire. In 7 days of bombardment and assault, in the stubborn determination of men who refused to quit because their orders said 12 hours and they had already done more than expected. They kept fighting because fighting mattered, because resistance mattered, because the world needed to see that Poland would not surrender without extracting a price. In the end, that was Westerplatte's true victory, not measured in military terms, but in human ones. They proved that free men defending their homeland could face tyranny on its own terms and make tyranny pay for every inch of ground. That lesson, learned at terrible cost on a tiny peninsula in the Baltic, would echo through every battle of the Second World War and beyond. The defenders of Westerplatte gave their nation and the world a gift: the knowledge that resistance was possible, that courage could multiply force, that even certain defeat did not require surrender. That gift, purchased with blood and suffering, remains one of the most precious legacies of the Second World War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.